So I think we've just had this session teed up brilliantly. Looking at open banking, people talk about a whole bunch of things when they talk about open banking. People talk about the seamless interoperability that Jim was just talking about, that we all aspire to, and how we do that. Sometimes that can be done through government intervention where banks don't get on with it. And we have Henry, who's an expert in what's happening in Europe, who's going to tell us a bit about that and why that's important. Sometimes it can be done through partnerships, and we have 3 partnership facilitators in different ways on this panel. Chris with Avid Exchange partners with banks to give great experiences to mutual customers. Laura from Wells Fargo does the same sorts of partnerships on the other side a lot of the time. Aubrey from Oracle facilitates them all. We also, sometimes when we talk about open banking, we talk about banking as a service, which is the idea that people can build on top of the assets of banks to build their own products to deliver directly to consumers and businesses. And then finally, we talk about the ability to create marketplaces, whether that's inside a bank, as some of the digital challenger banks in the UK and Germany are doing, offering other people's products to complement core banking, or whether that's from a non-bank bringing together banks with other financial and non-financial products. So a lot to cover in 45 minutes. Let's start with Henry and just get a baseline. I'm sure a lot of people in the room have heard about PSD2 in Europe without being totally sure exactly why it is or what it's important. So, Henry, in no more than about 3 minutes, can you tell us everything everyone in the room needs to know about PSD2 and why, and also what the context is for people that are doing business over here, just to make it more challenging.
Right. So that's a lot to cover in 3 minutes. So as Adam mentioned, there are numerous ways that you can describe open banking, and open banking has been catalyzed by a number of different factors. Now in Europe and in the UK, they've been catalyzed mainly by regulatory factors. That's not to say that people weren't thinking about, for instance, API as a service, API as a product models before, but it's really kind of being pushed to the forefront right now. In the UK, I'll start there. Regulators basically have turned around, the Competition Markets Authority within the UK has turned around to the 9 largest banks in the UK and said, you guys have to stand up APIs on a standardized basis in order to enable some core functionality. And core functionality in terms of open banking in the UK means, number 1, data portability. So that's the ability for a consumer to securely share their information with a third party, typically in return for services. An example of a service could be like data aggregation, personal financial management tools. And then secondly, enable access to certain functionality, and the functionality that we're focusing on is basically payments, and payments on a push payments basis. What I mean by that, to clarify, is basically a payment or money that's moved directly from your account. So it doesn't go into a traditional payment network. Typically goes into a faster payment rail. Then the third element in the UK, and this is a bit limited to the UK, is that we're looking to standardize product reference data. So that's like pricing, terms and conditions, that kind of stuff. Not necessarily terms and conditions, but how it's represented to the user when the user goes about trying to find what is the best product for them. Now, the reason why the UK has gone down that particular path is because it's driven by a couple of things. In 2014-ish, I'm not necessarily sure whether 100% got the date right, but around that period, the Competition Market Authority basically did a review of the retail banking landscape. They found a number of frictions, a number of deficiencies, and they want to address those deficiencies. They want to increase competition. They want to basically lead to good or preferential consumer outcomes, and that typically is represented by consumers getting bang for buck for their money. So getting the best product for them, not necessarily consistently getting into like high overdraft fee territory, getting the best rate for them in terms of kind of lending products, et cetera, et cetera. Europe, I know this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. Europe is similar to the UK, but slightly more nuanced. So the interesting thing about the UK is that the breadth of open banking, because of that inclusion of product reference data, is slightly broader. And the requirement to implement all this stuff through standardized APIs is slightly more prescriptive. In Europe, the regulation that's mandating open banking is PSD2. Similarly, it covers data portability, and similarly, it covers payment initiation. But Europe is still figuring out how they're going to go about implementing this stuff. It's likely that they'll go down a similar route in terms of the UK, and people are watching the UK closely in terms of implementing open banking via APIs and implementing open banking on a standardized basis as well. But we'll know more as the landscape moves on. One final kind of quick thing that I'll note, and I think I've just hit the 3-minute mark, is that the situation in Europe from a regulatory standpoint, and I think this parallels to some of the considerations in the US as well here. Europe, in terms of the regulators, have also been concerned with screen scraping. Screen scraping has taken off in Europe, not necessarily from just limited to a data aggregation standpoint, but also in terms of payment initiations. Right? There are certain payment portals or payment solutions that operate on a screen scraping basis in Europe, and regulators want to bring these guys into the regulatory umbrella, into the regulatory fold, and are considering through open banking migrating or seeing if there is another system that can be used as opposed to the current screen scraping system right now.
Thank you, Henry. That's great. So in other words, even shorter summary, banks are being told to do a lot of things by their regulators in the UK and EU. Is there any upside for banks here?
Well, so right now it's mainly driven by kind of regulatory competitive factors. There are upsides, but the upsides it's hard to think through right now, and a lot of the banks right now have been focused on the compliance agenda, and they're slowly kind of migrating towards a strategic agenda. Now, the strategic agenda in terms of what open banking represents, I mean, fundamentally, it's an interconnected system. There's almost like a federated system of access, secure access to data, et cetera, et cetera. What that means is that there's a whole bunch of things to consider there, and I think basically, Adam, you mentioned it earlier in your intro. You can think about basically building out your API suite. There's certain things that you have to do from a mandated basis, but you have, as a bank, having released these APIs, you've created or you brought in certain capability, you've acquired certain capability, and exposing these APIs is a question mark of whether there are value-added services that you can bolt onto this. That's one such consideration. A slightly more pressing consideration is that open banking could lead to, theoretically, it could lead to big change in how the financial services experience for consumers. You could see a situation developing where the user experience somewhat decouples from the online banking portal. If, for instance, users were to start using third parties in order to manage their finances on an ongoing basis. So from that perspective, there are opportunities for banks to think about, well, what should they be doing from a solution development standpoint? How will the ecosystem evolve to basically, and how will new opportunities emerge in terms of presenting new distribution channels for them? Will there be new ways and modes for them to engage with their consumers? Are there new business models for them to think about in terms of releasing APIs? So there's a whole breadth of stuff from, and I know I'm slightly going on a bit, but it's a whole breadth of stuff from basically enhanced functionality to the release of new products to the release of new services that enable this ecosystem. So there's a whole spectrum of things to consider.
Yeah, and banks can use the data too, right? So we now see people like ING coming in and trying to be a bit more on the front end of UK banking by using the data in from other institutions. So just because banks are being told to do this doesn't mean that they can't use the data from other institutions to give consumers a better picture of their financial affairs, right?
And it's across the board. It's basically, so I think the example that you're referencing is Yolt from ING.
Yeah.
So it ranges all the way from basically new products and solutions that are user-facing, all the way through to, well, how can I enhance certain processes more towards my back end? So in other words, if this data is used for onboarding or KYC purposes, can I automate certain processes that are slightly more manual and paper-based by having access to this information? There's a whole spectrum of stuff.
Great. Laura, you've actually got sort of responsibilities on both sides of the Atlantic. How does PSD2 look for you? Is it, what impacts it having on what Wells is doing in the EU, and does it seem like it's delivering good outcomes to you?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think you can look at things like PSD2 and other regulatory things as a blocker, or you can look at them as a catalyst. And I think we're really looking at it as a catalyst, right? Certainly, first part that we did was we reacted to the regulatory part that we needed to do for PSD1 and PSD2. But then what we've really looked at is there is a huge opportunity here to change the way banking is done. And we can either sit back and just be marginalized, right, and just be basically the secure place where you keep your funds, or you can play in that market and you can start to look at how can we interconnect with these fintechs in the right way to be able to offer both the secure opportunity of what a bank offers relative to being regulated, being licensed, holding those funds, but then also being able to help them in their broader relationship. We've actually engaged in that both in the U.S. and outside the U.S. We're looking at the integration into our new platform that we're building. How do we better leverage our data? How do we better integrate with our partners to be able to do that and really broaden the reach of our customers wherever they are? So whether they are in the U.S., where the bank out west is a big player across the United States, but also how do we help our customers reach outward globally? It's a global economy. How do we do that? As well as how do we help our customers outside the U.S. reach in? So our whole strategy has really changed to be that way. We're very much looking at that digital environment. We're looking at how do we innovate more quickly, which is, of course, unheard of in banks, right? We're very slow around how we do that. But I think we've seen how this new generation, I personally have 3 millennials that live at my house, so I get to see every day how incredibly important that is and how they are very much what is available. They are immediately always looking for that best opportunity. How can I best do my banking? None of them ever, I think, been in a banking center. They do everything so watching that and understanding that and seeing that that's really where the world is going so that people have that interaction, that integration. So I think the banks have a tremendous amount of data. We have a lot of data that we need to put in right formats that allow us not only to leverage it for ourselves, but to leverage it for those fintechs that we're integrating with. I mean, it is all about data exchange, right? It's all about data exchange. How do we improve data exchange and make that better? I think it also gives us an opportunity to what Henry was talking about, to look at new products and services that we can offer in a very integrated fashion so that our customers don't feel like they necessarily have to go to a lot of different places to get what they need. We could be that hub that allows them to get to those different services that they need to. Very much like the concierge model, I think that Jim was talking about. So that's absolutely where we're driving that. It helps us as well because if you think about it, if you're a global bank but you're really not licensed to have true retail relationships all over the world, this whole open banking allows us to really expand our reach and be able to do that in a way that works for everyone. It doesn't force all our customers to go up and open accounts everywhere in the world. It allows them to be able to actually integrate that relationship and be able to do that. So I think it's a great advance. Yes, you could look at it. You can be on the sidelines or you can be in the middle of it and figure out how to actually leverage this to make your business work better and make your customer experience better. And I think Wells Fargo is definitely on the side of how do we do that. And that's both in the U.S. and outside the U.S.
So recognizing that sort of what's public is probably just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you're doing, can you talk about some use cases or capabilities or partnerships that illustrate sort of the way that you think the world is going for Wells, its partners, and its customers?
Absolutely. So there's multiple places that we're looking to play right now. One is in the space of being able to do global receivables, right? So allowing our customers, because most customers want to either pay through credit card or they want to be able to do it through the local ACH network, which are mostly closed loop networks that force you to have accounts. But if you start looking at these fintechs that have determined how to do global receivables well, using virtual accounts and other ways to be able to allow you to liquidate those funds and move them into the United States or into your European hub or your Asia hub, that allows you to do that. We're also looking at payables. So how can you do payables all over the world? With that being able to leverage what we have, your accounts, wherever you have them, with Wells Fargo and be able to make those interconnections, feel comfortable that you've got that banking side of it for your funds, but that you can actually make the right exchanges, get the right information, and be able to do those types of interactions that you want to do. We're also looking at digital wallet type activities that we want to be able to do, the whole mobile wallet, digital wallet. You need to be able to get funds. You want to get funds easily. You're traveling all over the world. You want to be able to have an easy way to exchange onto your debit card the capabilities to be able to actually not have to go and actually get those funds, right? But actually use your debit card, have an account that's based off your US dollar that you can then change to any funds that you want. automatically. And it doesn't just say it's subtracted in US dollars, but actually subtracts it in your the currency that you're in, so you actually know where you're standing. Those are the types of activities that we're looking. So we're really trying to make that easier. And that's both across our business as well, into our business, our wholesale space, as well into our consumer space. We're actually looking at it across the entire continuum to be able to offer those types of activities. And it is fueled by working with a lot of the fintechs out there that have really advanced the capabilities.
Which is a wonderful transition, thank you. Chris, you're not a bank. You are, to a large extent, in the business of payments facilitation. It's and you need to connect with banks to in order to make experiences great for your customers. Can you talk to us a little bit about what some of the pain points in that have been for AvidXchange historically, and how you think this brave new world is going to help solve them?
Sure. Yeah, so we're not a bank, so thank you for clarifying that. The PSD2 conversation I find fascinating. When we started AvidXchange in 2000, our focus was on accounts payable. We were not in the payment space initially. And we were trying to solve a problem for users that were essentially, it's a very paper-intensive process, a lot of invoices floating around. We did start with commercial real estate, so the invoicing problem, when you have hundreds of locations but centralized AP, you've got a lot of approval process that's really, really manual. So that was the problem we really started solving in the beginning. And we found out quickly the value of integrations and APIs when the sales cycle, it required that we know how to get into those ERP systems and hundreds and hundreds of variations and versions. And so that really became the first problem technically around integrations that we had to solve. And not every accounting system, it's very similar to what we're talking about here. Accounting systems don't have a standard way to get data in or out. So we got really good at kind of tacking and jiving around whatever was available with the accounting system. And we did that for 11 years before we decided to get into the payment space. And I think in PSD2, we would be considered probably a payment initiator in that space. And that is a service that we focused on early on, serving that same customer base. So we didn't view the banks as the customer in the early days. We were servicing the same end users that had the accounts payable problem. And we had to work around the same type of issues. Okay, you're dealing with bank X, Y, or Z. There's different standards, there's different data, there's different protocols. And so same type of challenge we had before on a different scale. I think as we've continued to get more successful, because we focused on that end user experience, and I think that's what's so important. And Laura, I think I heard you hit on this too, but at the end of the day, we're solving problems for users. The users, as our generations who have never known anything other than an iPhone, they expect everything to be available from one app. And so you don't want to have them going from one app to another to solve one problem. And that's where we are in a lot of these cases today. We're making it more difficult on the end user than it needs to be. And now that we're starting to partner more with banks to sell our solution to their customers, I find that I'm continually having this conversation. And we're talking about, hey, we need you to do X, we need you to integrate this way or that way. And at the end of the day, I usually take it back to, let's talk about what we're doing to our end users. What is the experience that we're providing to them? And I think that conversation is happening a lot in different areas. The Yodleys and Plaid essentially giving us data, but we have to go through the nasty technique of screen scraping. But that's what's available in a standardized way. So at the end of the day, it's what we can do to make the end user's life more simple. When we talk to banks today and we talk about the end user experience, the thing that we keep running into is if you do things in a certain way, the end user experience is better on our platform. So even though we're trying to sell the same platform through multiple banks, it really comes down to the bank's API capabilities to determine what the end user experience is going to be. And ultimately, that's the problem we're really trying to tackle.
So as the CTO on this panel, why are APIs so essential to this?
The APIs, if it's a closed system and we can't get at the data, then the user experience, back to the user experience, is going to be kludgy. You're going to have to go between multiple systems. And so I don't know if that answers your question, but are you
So is it to some extent, just to tease it out for the room, is it the extent to be able to get the right information at the right time and just get what you need in an efficient way?
Right. Yes, that's essentially it. And you don't want to have a spinner on the screen. I always go back to user experience. I'm going to do this. I'm just going to apologize up front. But if you've ever sat on a screen and just watched things spin, it's not fun. It's going to end up frustrating users. And customers are going to go somewhere else. Users are going to go somewhere else. And ultimately, that's the problem. We want to make sure the user experience is what it should be. And it shouldn't matter which bank you're with. I mean, when you're using our platform, I don't want it to matter which bank you're with. But the reality is, because we don't have something like PSD2, it's different.
That's great. Thank you. Aubrey, you're a service provider to a bunch of banks and indeed a bunch of non-banks that are trying to work on these issues. It's kind of... how does this world look from your perspective? What do you think the interesting opportunities are for all of your customers to work better together?
So one interesting analogy I like to think about is when Eisenhower created the interstate highway system, long time ago, to drive this interconnectiveness. You had AAA that kind of spun up with those trip tickets. You had MapQuest from Google that created things. Then we had the smartphone, and Apple kind of started to digitize those. And then you have Waze, and then you go on until you get to the point you have Uber. And part of that got back in was driving some standards around how do things need to work? How do things need to interoperate? Jim was talking a lot about how Uber has become embedded in all of these other apps. Well, part of that is because they've decided to standardize on a set of APIs. And I think when a lot of these services get created, if you think that I need to go back to the ultimate, what the end journey is going to be 10 years from now. So Chris, I absolutely agree with what you're saying. I think it's all about how do you enable that right customer journey, but you need to have some standard set of APIs to go back and facilitate that. And I think that's one of the things that we've really tried to focus on at Oracle, is really, we're trying to cut across multiple pieces of the stack. So one is we're trying to figure out how do we provide the underlying infrastructure from a technology perspective to help you manage these APIs. We do help drive connectivity to a bunch of those ERP systems that Chris was talking about. But I think the other group where I sit in our kind of banking practice is actually having out-of-the-box APIs that really support PSD2. So if I'm Wells Fargo and I need to support PSD2 and I'm BBVA, does every bank need to go back and create those and maintain those? Or are those more off-the-shelf APIs we can buy commercially and then focus on building some other unique things that are going to be unique to our bank? And so I think our view is really saying, how do we start to drive some of these standard set of APIs around different sorts of initiatives, whether that is payments to support PSD2, how do we actually onboard a customer, how do we start to facilitate different types of inquiries? Because I think what we see is the ability to go back and help accelerate a bank to drive connectivity into that fintech ecosystem. And I think without a doubt, they certainly need it. It's interesting, all this screen scraping.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the real challenges here is it's almost the polar opposite of where Henry comes from and where I came from automatically, where we got the Competition Commission report because people were upset about 9 banks having 99% of the market and most of them having to get bailed out. Here, we've got like 12,000 banks and credit unions in the country, and that creates a massive collective action problem. So I'm curious, I'll send it to you and then send it down the panel. How do we best overcome that collective action problem and actually get to some kind of standard solution that works in the interests of everyone in the ecosystem? So
this was a bit of a debate we had kind of in the pre-call, which was, if you look at this, would the U.S. have done something like PSD2 had the Europeans really not tried to do that first? The same thing could be said for GDPR. Would we have done it? Well, what's interesting is you see a lot of the payments initiatives coming forth because a lot of the big payment clearing companies, and certainly all the card networks, are more US-based institutions. The same thing could be said for GDPR around privacy. Who are all the big tech companies in the consumer space? Well, they're all US. So I think what's interesting is you have this kind of outside the US kind of driving regulation. But I think what is really interesting is the opportunity to drive some bit of standards, because I think there's an opportunity to improve efficiencies around banks. And I think one of the things, if you look at what Avid is doing, and I think this is really where it gets back into kind of Oracle's more ERP spaces, if you can drive a better set of connectivity, and this is, I know certainly, Laura, where you sit in the wholesale bank, is drive better connectivity between a corporate and the bank to start to open some of that up, especially if I'm a large Fortune 500 company, where I'm going to have multiple banking relationships. I need to start consuming these APIs to drive the right kind of experience to my financial controller or CFO. Let's say I'm at Pfizer or something like that. I'm going to manage this. I need to do that in a much more standard way. So I actually think what we'll see first is it's probably going to come on the commercial side of the banking, and then I think it'll start to drop into consumer, because I think that will start to get more the economies of scale. So where Laura was highlighting the fact that, if you have to worry about where those accounts are domiciled, if I can start to drive API level access to this, then I can domicile those accounts in one place, and I start to expand my distribution channel.
Laura, Wells, along with a number of the other big banks, has been making a number of bilateral deals with non-bank players, and you have to start somewhere. Do you see that evolving towards an industry standard solution? And if so, how? And would you care to speculate on how long it might take?
So a couple things. One is, I think I always laugh when I hear API, right? Because, APIs have been around forever, but I think it's the difference on how we want to use APIs, right? That's what's evolved, right? It's the idea of an API. I think what's going to happen over time is that those APIs are almost going to become the commodity. And what's going to happen is, because we're going to have to get to a standard, and they're going to be the table stakes, just like being able to process a payment used to be the table stakes in a bank. And I think what's going to happen is that's what's going to be the expectation, so that actually people can have that interconnectivity, but then they can build on top of it, because that's really where the value is. They want to be able to get, some things are just going to become a standard of that's just the way you've got to be able to work, right? I mean, Uber's now a standard if you think about it, right? And when you think about how things have evolved, and I think same thing's going to happen with these APIs. They're going to become we're going to be forced into getting to, and I hope in a good way, because I'm very for it, but getting into these standards of how we use, how we actually interconnect and can exchange data, so that piece of it is very standardized, and that becomes the table stakes, and then it's what you can offer above that. So it really gives you the opportunity to make that customer experience as good as you possibly can. I think that's really important. I think banks in particular have to get a little bit out of their own way relative to doing that.
Yes.
We, with the bank issues that there were, and now that we've, the pendulum on risk, we have to think differently, right? We have to think differently about risk and the integration and what that really means, and that's going to be a big part of driving those standards that actually get adopted and used, right? Because we've had lots of standards over time, but they actually didn't get used very well, because it was kind of a half buy-in, right? Because a little bit worried about giving your data away, a little bit worried about the security angle of it. We've got to really optimize that. We've got to get security down well, because that's one of the biggest concerns, right? And then we have to get to a point where we really are willing to do that exchange, because it's the opportunity to help the customer and give them the right experiences at one place, right? And be able to drive, the next level of banking. What is that going to be? I think that's a really critical play.
And do you think it would help or hinder things for the government to get involved to the extent it's done in Europe?
Well, that's a tough one, always in the United States right now, isn't it?
Well, some parallel administration in Washington that might actually think about it.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. If you think about what the government just did with the internet, right, and the changes that went in with the internet, that opened the world a lot differently than it is today, right, for what was been done. So I think in some ways some people are really against that, some people are really for that. It's going to be kind of interesting to see how it plays out. But I think the government has a role, but I think it has to be, because this is global, because it's global, I think we have to think bigger, right? And I think sometimes we struggle with the bigger thought, right? That we talk about the global environment, the global economy, and all those types of things, but I think sometimes it's a little bit more difficult to do that. I think it's easier in Europe, to think more globally because of the way the countries are interconnected and the way EU works versus US, where we've been kind of a closed system. So I think the government can help, but I don't think they are necessarily the drivers, is what I would say.
Chris, what do you think about, what looks promising to you in terms of standardization? And within the context of that, any free advice you want to give the banking industry, more than welcome.
I love the PSD2 concept. From our perspective, I can see from an expense standpoint that's probably not favorable to the banks, but long-term I think it is. It's whether you're looking at it in the short-term cost or the long-term strategic capabilities that you add. But when we work with a bank, we're more than happy to create the standard of the banks that we work with, and we do that to some extent, but there's always some system on the back end that has some variation that just doesn't work the way you want it to. And so I think it's got to start at those technology layers as well. The capabilities that we're using on the back end in the banks has to start creating some standard capabilities that's the only way the standard APIs are going to work. But that being said, as a startup, a fintech, we're eager to help start solving the problem. We'll help create whatever standards we need, but we're not going to stop working with a bank if they don't have a standard. That messiness is sometimes good for us, creates some bit of a moat or a barrier that's harder for competitors to break in, but ultimately, we'll figure it out. It's just going to take us longer. So I would love the APIs. I'd love the standardization. If you're in the technology realm, you've probably heard this before. Standards are great. Everybody should have one. That's typically what happens. I think you were referring to that, Laura. The standards that if they don't get adopted, if it's not pushed down by government regulation, then it's probably going to be fragmented and you're going to end up with many standards.
But I would just to respond to that, because I think what's interesting, I think if you look at how Uber or all these others came standards, those weren't government mandated standards, right? And so I think part of the real message is, I think standards would be nice because I think it helps drive interoperability. But I think one of the clear opportunities for the banks is to open up. And I think that's really part of the big initiative of, if you get back to Henry where you were starting, is these APIs, if you have standards, it makes it easier to open up and interoperate. But I think the ability just to open up so I have a more standard way to drive connectivity is a huge step forward. And then if it says all of a sudden I need to change this specification to have the parameters in this order or this long or expand it, that becomes a much easier change than putting it in place in the first place.
Although it's worth noting there are standards and standards, right? So even with PSD2, how you connect in Spain is going to look somewhat different to how you connect in Finland.
ISO's not ISO's.
Correct.
But if you were to make you dictator for a day, at least in this narrow area, you would
like
pass
it.
PSD2 like law here, would you?
Yeah, if we could standardize and get everybody to comply, that would be awesome. That sounds like utopia to me. I don't think it'll happen.
Henry, from across the other side of the Atlantic, what do you see in terms of standardization here, and what paths do you see that look promising?
I think it's a tricky one. Standards do require a degree, and standards, I guess, to a certain degree, before I touch on the point I was going to touch on. It's not necessarily, it doesn't end with the standards. There's also the question of how those standards are implemented, what represents best practice within that implementation. There's also a question mark of kind of access, how open you're going to be in terms of access to the APIs, whether they're going to operate slightly more on a closed basis, on a partnership basis, or there's a slight difference in the UK and Europe on a fully open basis. And all of these things kind of drive, I think, basically what we're getting at the end of the day, which is basically adoption amongst developers and adoption amongst consumers, and creation of a new breed of better financial service products that could come from the incumbents or could come from fintechs. In terms of how standards potentially could be rolled out here and the role that government could play, well, collective action, the slight issue with collective action is that you require everybody, well, a lot of people to get around the table on a collective basis. And that can happen one or two ways. Either the government brings you to the table or they come to the table themselves. Now, the way that it's worked within Europe is that typically there is a market or industry friction that needs to be addressed that has been identified. So the question mark is, are there parallels to be drawn across into the US on that basis? And if there aren't necessarily direct parallels, the interesting thing about UK and Europe is that it almost provides a bit of a rear view mirror for the US to move on a voluntary basis or to increase speed of movement on a voluntary basis, in the sense that at the end of the day, if I look at UK specifically, we've basically mandated the use of APIs, mandated the use across the major 9 banks. There's something to the tune of 80, 90%, don't quote me on the figures here, but 80 to 90% market coverage in terms of certain banking products, be it current accounts. So that means that what we've in effect done is like slightly fast track the development of a system so that you've got a system in place for base level functionality, for base level data portability and payment initiation, but you've got a system with quite extensive coverage there in place. What that means is what makes it interesting for the US is then you can take a watching brief on us, so to speak, in terms of how that ecosystem evolves, what opportunities arise within that ecosystem, where value is created, and to a certain degree on a commercial basis, areas where you collectively as an industry may want to move, may want to coalesce and move towards in a similar manner to which we've done in the UK. What I'll say is also there's also probably 2 approaches that the US counterparts can go down on a voluntary basis, slightly park the government kind of regulatory basis. But on a voluntary basis, it's either kind of looking to create like base level functionality that the UK has, or it could be a case that you coalesce around certain use cases, right, that are enabled by sharing data. An example of an area that I'm aware various jurisdictions are looking into, largely on a voluntary basis, sometimes with the regulators involved as well, is stuff like development of digital passports, digital KYC, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, these are areas which are potentially communally required and processes that don't necessarily represent distinct areas of competitive advantage, where there could be a case for development of a shared utility, for example. And that could be a road that the US goes down.
No. Thank you. We've got about 8 minutes left, according to the time in front. And I could carry on asking questions, but I will only do that if there aren't anyone questions or comments from the audience. So.
The pain of switching from one organization to another is removed. And because that pain is removed, the service or quality of each one of the organizations, businesses, banks have to be that much higher. And so that seems to be a friction point for some organizations to even adopt it. How do you get past that, or what is Wells Fargo specifically starting? Are they focusing more on the service so they're getting past that fear, or how do you address that?
So, yeah, it's a great question, right? I mean, I think it's a combination, I think, of risk, the risk appetite, and the fear, I mean, of kind of getting out of that banking model. And I think that, again, I think it's back to the point that you can sit back as a bank and become really a commoditized and marginalized, or you can figure out a way to do that. And the way to do that is to integrate. Now, the biggest issue, and I think it's a point Jim made this morning, right, is that a lot of the banks are old iron, right? They don't have, we don't necessarily have the good integration network that we need. And I think those are the biggest concerns right now, is how do you actually get the data out of the systems in a way that you can then leverage that data to support the activities, because it's not all into a centralized database necessarily across all that and connected. I mean, have been in banking for a long time, right? Just the whole thing of getting those relationships clean, especially like on the wholesale side, keeping them clean, making sure your data is feeding in so that you're always updating that, and you have have truly systems of record and then provisioning points to be able to do that and really get that good, clean data in the right way and make it available. I think that's one. And I think the other big fear is the security, right? It's the security piece, because people have always looked at banks as a very safe kind of place, right? My money's safe, you're controlling my data, right? That type of thing. And, banks kind of fell behind that, right? It's from a regulatory perspective and that type of thing. And I think that's the piece of it. So how do you find the balance, right? It's the balance of making that data available in a safe way that allows your customers to be able to do that. And I think that's where the banks actually are struggling, right? There is no real standard. You look at any standard that's out there. Okay, you say ISO. Well, what level of which version of ISO are you on, right? How are you integrating or something like that? So I think that's where it is. And I think PSD2 and other things like that are forcing banks to look at that, right? It's like, so that's where I think the government can play somewhat, right? There's some regulation into it, but they still have to figure out how to do it in really a collaborative way that makes it work smoothly, right? So they can't just say, okay, well, I'm going to now comply. The banks have to comply together, just like we have to comply with the fintechs. And I think it's that partnership, right? Because today when you get a regulation, you say, okay, I'm going to figure out how I'm going to comply. But now it's got to be, I've got to figure out how I'm going to comply, and I got to work with everybody else on how they're going to comply so that I really can make it that kind of open environment. It's just a different mentality that we have to get ourselves to.
Yeah.
But
Can I
make one comment?
Can I just build on that?
Yeah.
Precise. It's one of the hidden benefits for PSD2 that makes it a lot easier for us in Europe than it is here, is that the people that access the information are going to be regulated and held accountable directly. And one of the big problems we've got here is that even if it's user permission data, there is a genuine fear that the regulators could usefully allay that we will be held accountable for what happens with the data, the payment initiation capability. And that's something that I think can be solved by smart guidance, even in the current environment in DC.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think the comment around switching, because I think it's interesting. When Henry didn't talk about this, but in the UK, they've mandated this ring fencing of the banks and allowing you to kind of switch bank accounts, kind of like you can switch phone companies here and keep your number. But it didn't drive huge changes in people switching banks. And I think part of that probably could be a statement on, well, the service is the exact same, so why am I going to go back and switch? I think the real impetus that it comes as a part of this opening up is how do the banks start to get innovative around the services that they're offering? So, and I think that's really starts to be this huge opportunity. So I think where Laura was talking about is they've got all this data. It's not accessible and leverageable the way that, say, Google and Facebook and all these companies can leverage that data. And where Jim was going is, you really need to figure out how do you unlock that data so you can drive the right sort of customer experiences these customers need. And then when you do that with some of the standardization, it will allow them probably to be winners and losers in that space around who does the best job around delivering that.
In a secure mode.
Absolutely,
That's
security,
the big,
very important.
That's the big, and you've got that whole battle going on between the younger generation, not as worried about it, but U.S. is aging out. So you look at some of that, right, and they're uncomfortable, right? My parents, they'll go out and they'll look at stuff all over the internet, but they will never purchase something off the internet. No way, right? So, my kids use everything off their phone. So it's kind of an interesting dichotomy too, right, to figure out how to balance that.
So any other questions?
Yeah.
Pretty much losing on a daily basis, right? I mean, they've lost the mortgage market. They're losing a lot of the other lending market. When we hear about bank innovation, it's actually a bad copy of things like Apple Pay, Venmo. Why do we have, I don't see what the big driver is, make banks something that they're not. Banks are deposit-taking institutions. That's what they were 200 years ago. That's probably what they're going to be in 20 years. I don't understand why we don't have, companies that are actually innovating products, innovating services up on the stage. Why this push to reinvent something that's, I think, is just an outmoded model?
So I'll have a crack at that one, if it's okay. I'll take moderator prerogative. Partly because, I mean, I'm actually working on something else, which is banking as a service. How do you open the capabilities of a bank to allow other people to build on top of you and be a sort of as more of a B2B2C or B2B2B model? So if anyone's looking for a bank partner in the room, I'll be around till 4:30. Come find me. But there are, I think, a lot of things you could say, sure, banks can do things other people can't. They can transform maturities, they can access payment systems, focus on that, focus on being the pipes. There's a bit of an inconvenient fact, though, that it's actually, for whatever reason, it's almost much harder to get people to switch banks than almost anything else. And sort of behaviorally, we've got all of these great fintech products, a lot of which have real trouble getting beyond the 10% of the population base that are early adopters of these things. So it's kind of, to me, it's a bit of a puzzle. You can make that argument, but people are actually, people will grumble about their banks, but they don't change, and they're still not changing in great number despite a larger number of viable alternatives.
And I would say, Jimmy, in this afternoon on financial inclusion, we're going to have some other fintechs that are going to be coming back and talking about how they're delivering their services consuming some of these APIs.
Services, so banks are losing out, I think, in a really big way. You know, you can try to reinvent them, but I think the legacy thought, as well as the legacy thought, is constrained, right?
I'm afraid we're blinking red here, so I think everyone on the panel is going to be around the rest of the day. Please come and find us and continue the debate. Thank you.